They called her a traitor, a temptress, a weapon of the enemy. History paints her as the woman who sold love for gold, but no prophet ever wrote the real reason, because the truth was far too inconvenient. Delilah was not a heroine, but she wasn't a monster either. She lived in a world where women didn't get to choose. Sides were chosen for them. Samson was the enemy of her people, a warrior they feared, a man whose strength destroyed everything she knew, and still she let him into her home, and he let her into his heart. Then he placed her between himself and her own life. When she cut his hair, she wasn't thinking of victory. She was thinking of how to survive. This isn't a story about love. It's a story about survival. And this is who she was, Delilah. Delilah was not born into power or prophecy. She was not of royal blood, not a daughter of priests or warriors. She lived in the in-between, a woman known, but never truly seen. Her house stood just outside the city walls, on the edge, where shadow met civilization, where markets gave way to silence and gossip became the only currency that mattered. People knew her name but spoke it in halftones, as if it carried weight they could not explain. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty was never safe. It drew eyes, and eyes brought judgment, and judgment in her world rarely cared about truth. Had carved a life for herself with precision, not luxurious but comfortable, not loud but stable. She lived alone by choice, not for lack of options. Men came and went, some hopeful, some fearful, but none remained. Delilah understood the fragility of peace. She did not rely on affection to keep her grounded. She relied on silence, distance, control. Her days were spent managing her home, trading herbs, oils, linen. She was not poor. She was not rich. She was a woman who knew how to live under the radar, who knew how to listen before speaking, and how to speak without revealing. It was a balance she had mastered, until the rumors began. At first, it was only a name spoken with awe and tremors. Samson, the Israelite, the judge, the weapon. He was a myth in motion, a man said to kill with his bare hands, a man who tore lions apart and burned entire harvests to the ground. He was strength given flesh, rage in the shape of a man. He moved through cities like a storm, leaving behind broken gates and the fear of retaliation. Delilah did not need to see him to know he was real. She could feel it in the way people changed when they spoke of him, the way even the soldiers lowered their voices as if strength itself might hear and answer. His reputation reached her before his footsteps. The Philistines, her own people, grew restless, tense. They spoke in hushed gatherings, no longer confident in their defenses. This Samson had no army, no temple, no title, only power, unnatural, unchecked power. And worst of all, he was unpredictable. He obeyed no king, he answered to no one, which meant anyone could become his target. And when it was whispered that he had entered their city again quietly, without threat, like a ghost, the fear became strategy. Delilah had no allegiance to Israel, but she also held no love for the Philistine lords. Their politics were as brutal as their enemies, their decisions made in chambers far above the heads of women like her. She had lived on their fringes, tolerated but never trusted, useful until inconvenient. And she had seen what happened to useful women when they outlived their purpose. There were no second chances. There was no protection, only silence. was sweeping her floor when they arrived. Not soldiers, not messengers, but representatives well-dressed, soft-spoken. They did not ask for hospitality. They expected it. They sat at her table and spoke with politeness, so polished it cut. They said his name casually, as if it held no weight. They smiled when they said he had been seen watching her, that he had asked her name, that perhaps he would come to her soon. They were not there to warn her. They were there to prepare her and to make an offer. Their words were honey dipped in venom. They did not demand. They offered her a role, a way to help her people, a way to become more than a name on the outskirts. All she had to do was discover his secret, the source of his strength, and pass it on. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough. Just once. Delilah said nothing. She smiled. She served them wine. She watched their hands, their eyes, the way they relaxed too easily in her home. They thought she would be flattered. They thought the gold they promised would be enough. But Delilah was not moved by coin. She was moved by consequence. She knew what they were really saying. Help us, or disappear. After they left, she sat in the dim light of her chamber for hours, not thinking, listening to the quiet, to her own breath, to the echoes of a future already beginning to turn. She did not know Samson, not yet, but already her life was orbiting his name. Already she was being pulled into a story that had no safe ending. The world would remember her one way, but she had not yet made a single move. She was still just a woman, alone, caught between forces greater than herself. A woman whose only crime, so far, was being noticed. But she knew enough about stories to recognize the beginning of a trap disguised as a choice. And still she waited, because the storm was coming, and it was wearing a man's face. He arrived without warning. No entourage, no declaration, no sign that he was anything more than a weary traveler in the late hours of the day. But Delilah knew it was him the moment she opened the door. Not by his size, though his presence filled the space like heat, but by the stillness that followed him. The kind of silence that enters a room before violence or after it. His eyes did not roam. They landed directly on hers, not with demand or hunger, but with the cold curiosity of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. She offered him food, a place to rest, nothing more. He accepted with the ease of a man who knew he could not be refused. That night marked the beginning of the end, though neither of them would name it as such. Delilah moved through the house with practiced grace, her routine unchanged, her expression calm. But inside, her thoughts were a tangle of warning and fascination. This was not how she had imagined him, not the beast they described, not the monster children whispered about. He was strong, yes, but not wild. His strength was contained, coiled beneath the surface like a storm not yet unleashed. He spoke little, observed much. There was something broken behind his confidence, something deeply human, and Delilah, for all her caution, could not ignore that each day he stayed, the line between stranger and shadow blurred. He spoke in fragments, offered pieces of himself, like someone testing the water for betrayal. Delilah offered nothing in return, not at first. She watched, she listened, and slowly she began to understand that the man in her home was not just running from enemies, he was running from himself, from whatever burden his strength had become, from the gods who no longer spoke clearly. from the people who cheered for him in daylight and feared him in the dark. The Philistines returned on the third night. They did not knock. They waited until the house was quiet, until Samson was asleep in her room and the lamps were nearly burned down. Then they emerged from the shadows, 2 men, cloaked, eyes sharp. They said nothing at first, only handed her a small sack of gold and reminded her of the agreement. Delilah did not touch the coins. She only asked what would happen if she refused. Their answer was a smile, not cruel, just certain. She did not sleep that night. She watched him instead. Body at rest, the tightness in his jaw loosened in sleep. His arm curled under the pillow, as if still bracing for war. He looked peaceful, vulnerable, and that terrified her more than anything else, because it meant he trusted her. Not completely, perhaps, but enough to close his eyes beneath her roof. Enough to breathe deeply without reaching for a weapon. Delilah had lived long enough to know that trust was dangerous, especially from men like him, especially from men like her. The next day, she asked him about his strength, casual, light, a joke wrapped in a question. He laughed. Lead told her a tale about ropes, about weakness, about tricks. She pretended to believe him. That night, when he slept, she tried the test. Just once, just enough to know he had lied. When he woke, amused and unharmed, she smiled and said nothing. The Philistines, watching from the dark, waited. She sent them away, but they returned, again and again. Each time with more promises, more gold, more threats, left unspoken but heavy in the air. Delilah became a woman, split into one who smiled at her guest, fed him, listened to his stories, and another who counted the weight of betrayal like stones in her pocket. She had not asked for this, but now there was no escape, not for her, and maybe not for him. The longer he stayed, the more she saw the truth behind his eyes. He wanted to be known, not as a warrior, not as a judge, but as a man. He wanted someone to see the burden, the curse, the cost of his strength. And she did. God help her, she did. But it changed nothing. She asked again. He lied again. Each time the stories grew more absurd. Each time her heart fractured further, because he was testing her too. And he, too, had already made his choice. He was never going to tell her. He didn't trust her, not really. He had slept in her bed, whispered half-truths into her ear. But when it came to the core of him, the secret, the sacred source, he kept it locked away. She could not blame him. She had done the same. But the Philistines were growing impatient, and Delilah knew what that meant. Their promises would turn to violence. Not against him, against her. They would make her an example. No trial, no warning, just disappearance. A body in the hills, a name unspoken. So she asked again, one last time. And when he finally told her the truth, she did not rejoice. She did not even believe him at first. But then she saw it in his face, the quiet defeat of a man who had given away the only thing he had left, not for gold, not for loyalty, but for something dangerously close to love. Delilah said nothing. She kissed his shoulder, turned away, and stared at the door for hours. By morning, she had made her decision, not out of greed, not out of cruelty, but because the only thing more terrifying than betraying him was becoming the next name buried by silence. Delilah moved through her days like someone walking across ice, each step carefully measured, each glance over her shoulder calculated, Each word softened to conceal the scream building in her chest. There was no room left for comfort, no space for peace. Samson still lingered in her home, unaware of the storm twisting silently around him. She cooked, she cleaned, she smiled, and all the while she held a secret so sharp it might split her in two. The knowledge of his strength, the truth he had given her after so many games and evasions, now pulsed in her hands like a living thing. It was not a secret, it was a decision, and it had already begun to burn. He stayed longer than he should have. Perhaps he thought her home was safe. Perhaps he thought she was. Delilah watched him sleep and tried to understand how a man so feared could be so careless with his own survival. His breath was even, his muscles slack, his guard completely lowered. She could see the curve of his lips, the rise and fall of his chest, the scar along his forearm where an old battle had left its mark. He slept like someone who believed in rest, and she hated him for it, not out of anger, but out of envy. Because she could not rest. She had not rested in weeks. The nights were the worst. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of wind against the window reminded her that time was running out. The Philistines had given her no deadline, but their eyes had said enough. She knew what failure looked like. She had seen it before in other women, in the vanished, the unnamed. She had seen how easily people became warnings. They would not give her another chance. She had become their liability the moment Samson stepped through her door. If she didn't deliver him, she would be the one delivered to silence, to darkness, to whatever punishment came for traitors to their cause. But betrayal was not as simple as action. It was not a switch to be flipped. It was a slow erosion of self. She could feel it happening inside, her resistance worn thin by the weight of inevitability, her instincts dulled by the constant tension. She had begun to forget who she was before him, before the visits, before the gold, before the choice that was not really a choice at all. She had not been innocent, but she had been something close to free. Now every breath felt borrowed, and still she couldn't do it. Not yet. Each time she crept near him in the night, each time she looked at the blade hidden beneath the floorboard, her hand trembled, not because she doubted what would come after, but because of what would come before, the moment his eyes opened, the moment realization set in. The moment his face changed from trust to something else, something ruined. She feared that moment more than anything, because she had seen it before. The look of a man who believed a woman belonged to him, the flicker of betrayal, the twist of rage, the cold certainty that whatever she did know matter. How necessary would never be forgiven. Samson might not strike her, might not even speak a word, but she knew that whatever passed between them after the truth was revealed would never be whole again. And there was a part of her, still buried, deep, that longed not to be hated. That longing made her weak. It made her hesitate. It made her hope, against reason, that some third path might emerge, that he would leave before she acted, that the Philistines would forget, that the gods might intervene. But no one came. No hand reached into the story to pull her out. She was alone in a decision that had already been made for her. She began to avoid his eyes. When he spoke, she nodded but did not answer. When he laughed, she looked away. He noticed. She could feel it in the way his hand lingered on hers longer than before, in the way he searched her face like he was trying to find the woman he thought he had trusted. He was not a fool, but he was tired, and tired men ignore the signs that frighten them. Each morning, Delilah watched the horizon, not for salvation, for certainty. She knew that soon he would either be gone or bound, and so she rehearsed, in her mind, over and over, the act, the timing, the silence she would have to hold. She practiced the steadiness of her hand, the absence in her face, the stillness in her breath. She became her own executioner, shaping the moment in advance, trying to remove the ache from it, but it never left. It only grew heavier. There were times, brief and flickering, when she almost warned him, when her lips parted in the dark, when her hand reached for his shoulder. But the image of her own death stopped her every time, because there would be no forgiveness, not from him, not from the Philistines, not from the world that would always believe she had chosen freely. She had not. She was surviving, and survival, in this story, demanded silence. It demanded betrayal. It demanded the death of a version of herself she could never reclaim. So she waited, with scissors under the floor, with fire in her lungs, with a heart split down the middle and no one to show it to. She waited. The decision was not made in a single moment, but rather shaped in fragments, stolen hours of restless thought, sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, silent mornings when her hands moved through routine, but her mind was elsewhere. Delilah had become a vessel of tension. Every breath she took felt like an act of resistance against a truth that had already settled inside her. The plan had never been hers. It had been given to her, whispered by men in robes with soft voices and sharp eyes. But now it belonged to her completely. She would carry it out, and she would carry the weight that came with it. The tools were simple: a blade, a bed, a silence so deep it could swallow the moment whole. She had prepared it all without fanfare. No ceremony, no drama, just quiet calculation, born of necessity and fear. The blade she chose was not new. It was small, sharp, and wrapped in cloth to silence its edge. She kept it beneath the table, then moved it to a hollowed crack beneath the bed frame, where she could reach it without sound. She practiced retrieving it with one hand. She practiced breathing through her nose so the rise and fall of her chest wouldn't shake her fingers. Every detail mattered, not because she sought perfection, but because she refused to allow chaos to be the thing that destroyed her. She waited for the right night, not too soon, not too late. She watched him carefully, studied his rhythm, the way his strength dissolved into sleep after wine and warmth. She knew the exact moment when his muscles loosened, when his body surrendered. He trusted her. That was what made it possible. That was what made it unbearable. In another life, perhaps, that trust would have been something sacred. Here, it was the thing she had to use against him. She said little that evening. He spoke more than usual, perhaps sensing a shift in the air. He talked about his past, not the battles or the victories, but the spaces between them. He spoke of loneliness like someone who had worn it for too long. Delilah listened and offered nothing in return. Her face remained calm, her hands steady, her voice soft. Inside, she was unraveling. But she had grown skilled at hiding the seam. When sleep took him, it did so quickly. His breathing slowed, his jaw slackened. The weight of exhaustion pulled him beneath. Delilah waited longer than she needed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds until she was sure. Then she moved. Her bare feet touched the floor with soundless precision. She retrieved the blade in darkness, the moonlight slanting through the window just enough to show her the edge. Her hands did not shake, not because she was strong, but because she had already cried all her fear into the pillow the night before. She knelt beside the bed, brushed his hair gently across his shoulder, and began. The first lock fell without resistance. It landed like betrayal. The second felt heavier. She paused after the third, her chest tightening with something she could not name. By the time the final lock lay in her lap, she felt hollow, not victorious, not safe, just emptied. As if she had carved away a part of herself alongside his strength. She signaled to the men waiting outside, and they came without a sound. The room flooded with movement, tropes, shouts, the heavy shift of bodies, and the cracking of a world that had finally collapsed. Samson woke with confusion, his limbs slow, his eyes searching. She did not meet his gaze. She stared at the wall, at the flickering lamp, at anything but him. They dragged him away before he could speak. Before she could. She remained where she was, the blade still in her hand. His hair pooled beside her, like something sacred turned to ash. The house fell quiet again, too quickly, and she sat alone in the space where he had slept, her body rigid, her lungs refusing to exhale. The gold would come, they had said. She would be rewarded, protected. She did not care. She did not even remember why it had once mattered. Outside, the wind changed direction. Dust kicked against the threshold. Delilah closed the door slowly, and when she turned back toward the bed, she realized the silence was not empty. It was the beginning of something else, a life that could never return to what it had been, a name that could never be spoken without the weight of what she had done. There would be no undoing it, no forgiveness, only the echo of scissors in the dark, and a man who had fallen not in battle, but in trust, and she had been the hand that delivered it. The city awoke to news of his capture before the sun had fully risen. It spread not as a whisper, but as a wave rolling from the high courts to the muddy streets, echoing in every breathless conversation, every startled gasp. Samson had fallen, the unbreakable man, the one who slaughtered armies with bone and rage, had been taken like a lamb, bound like a criminal. The Philistines celebrated with a kind of feverish joy, reserved only for the defeat of a legend. And at the center of their triumph, though never named directly, stood Delilah. They did not thank her, not truly. There were no feasts in her honor, no songs sung in her name. The men who had come to her with promises and gold now kept their distance. She had done what they asked. She had given them everything. And still, she was treated like a tool used, useful, but not revered. The gold arrived in silence, in a sealed pouch left at her door. No message, no protection, just payment. As if the weight of what she had done could be measured in coins. The streets watched her now, not openly, but she felt the shift. The women eyed her with tight lips and narrowed stares. The men with something more complicated, fear, fascination. Perhaps a kind of cruel respect. To them, she had crossed a line. She had touched power and survived. And for that, she could never be trusted again. Samson, they said, had been blinded, his eyes taken as punishment, his strength vanished like breath in winter. He was paraded through the city square in chains, mocked and spat upon, no longer feared, but pitied. Delilah did not go to see him. She could not. She imagined him walking with shoulders bent, not from weight, but from betrayal. She imagined his hair slowly growing back, the memory of her hands still embedded in his scalp. She imagined his silence, the absence of his voice where once there had been thunder, and she could not bring herself to look. Her home became quieter in the following days. People came less often, customers thinned, conversations ended when she entered the room. She had not realized how loud approval had been until it disappeared. In the eyes of the city, she had served her purpose. And now she was dangerous in a new way, not because of what she might do, but because of what she had already done. They feared that she might betray again, that she might not stop at Samson. But no one ever asked her why. Not once. No one asked what it had cost her to stand beside the bed that night with a blade in her hand. No one asked what it felt like to hear his breath hitch as the first lock fell. No one asked about the sleepless nights before, the endless calculations, the silence that became a second skin. They only saw the result, and results in the hands of men become judgment. She walked the marketplace one afternoon just to feel her feet against stones, to remind herself that she still existed outside the walls of her house. A boy selling fruit stopped when he saw her. He dropped an apple and did not bend to pick it up. His eyes followed her until she passed. She wanted to speak, to explain, to scream, to say she hadn't done it for glory or gold, but she said nothing. Her throat closed around the words. Before they formed, what explanation could matter now? In the quiet of her home, she played the moment over again. Not the cutting, not the arrest, but the look on his face just before the soldiers took him. That brief second when he understood, when the trust collapsed. There had been no anger, no shouting, just a question in his eyes. One she could not answer. One he would never ask again. She sometimes wondered if he still thought of her. In the dark chambers where he now labored, broken and bound, she wondered if he hated her, if he whispered her name like a curse, or if he had erased her completely, the way people erased pain too large to carry. That was the part she couldn't stand, not the hatred, but the possibility that she had become nothing in his memory. Delilah did not regret saving her own life, but she regretted what it had taken to do so. She had not meant to be remembered this way. She had not set out to ruin anyone. She had only wanted to stay alive, to avoid becoming another casualty in a war she never joined. But survival, she had learned, often comes with a price, and hers was paid in the form of a man brought low and a silence she would never shake. The city sang of Samson's fall, but no one wrote a song about the woman who bore the weight of that fall in her own body. No one asked what it did to her, because they didn't want to know. Because knowing would mean admitting that maybe the villain they created wasn't a villain at all. Just a woman, just afraid, just trying to live. They would not remember her kindly. Delilah understood this now. Her name would live on, not in truth, but in shadows. In stories told from pulpits and scrolls, she would become a warning, a lesson, a seductress, the woman who brought down a man chosen by God. That was the version that would survive, the one trimmed of complication, scrubbed of context, reshaped into something simple and sharp enough to control. It would not matter that she had lived in fear, that her choices had been carved by the hands of others, that her betrayal was not born of cruelty, but of survival. History would flatten her, reduce her, but she had not survived to be understood. had survived to live. After Samson's death, the world shifted again. Word spread that he had pulled down the temple with his own hands, crushing himself and hundreds of Philistines beneath stone and timber. Some called it justice, others called it tragedy. But no one called it what it truly was, a reckoning. The final act of a man who had been broken twice. Once by the ones who called him enemy, once by the one who called him lover. Delilah sat in silence when the news came. No tears, no prayers, just the slow, deep ache of something she could not name. They did not come for her after that. The Philistine lords had what they wanted. The danger had passed. She had become irrelevant again, her usefulness extinguished along with the man she had helped bring down. But obscurity did not return her peace. It returned her to the cage of memory in the quiet of her home. She moved through each day as if trying to erase the echo of his presence. She washed the same sheets, lit the same lamps, walked the same floorboards, but every corner held a fragment of him, a voice half heard, a breath, a weight in the bed beside her that no longer existed, and beneath it all, a question that had begun to take root and twist. Had he known what she would do before he told her? Had he seen the truth in her eyes and chosen to fall anyway? Not out of love, but out of exhaustion, out of surrender. She would never know. That, too, was part of her sentence. Years passed, faces changed, empires rose and fell, and still the story of Samson and Delilah lingered, told and retold, rewritten, cleaned up, used, but never told honestly. They called him the judge, the strong man, the deliverer. They called her the whore, the traitor, the downfall. They turned her into an archetype, a symbol of womanhood, twisted by beauty and ambition. They never told the part where she hesitated, where she wept, where she waited in the dark with a blade in her hand and regret blooming in her throat. They never told the part where she was human, and Delilah, for her part, never tried to correct them. She left no letter, no testimony. She had seen what truth was worth in a world ruled by men and myth. It wasn't worth her breath. It wouldn't change their minds. The only record of her truth lived in the silence between verses, in the pause before her name was spat, in the trembling voices of women who recognized something familiar in her story. She became more than herself, a shape, a warning, a ghost. But beneath that legend, there had been a woman with a life full of corners no one wanted to look into. And that woman had made a choice. Not because she hated Samson, not because she wanted gold, but because she was afraid, because she had no army, because no one had ever protected her. In the end, they remembered her for the blade, for the fall, but not for the silence that came before, not for the 1,000 ways she had tried to avoid it, not for the nights she couldn't sleep, not for the moment she turned away, unable to watch them drag him from the home they had briefly shared. Story was never just a story of betrayal. It was a story of pressure, of survival in a world where women like her were never safe, only spared. Her betrayal was not the exception, it was the symptom of systems built to use, to discard, to punish. And so the world told its version, and she lived with the truth that she had loved him in her way, that she had mourned him in silence, that she had never wanted to be remembered, only to be left alone. But even that, the world would not grant her, because even in death, Samson's shadow stretched across her name, and in every retelling, Delilah was forced to fall all over again.